Welcome to week 6, Globalization and Nationalism. This week, we are going to put a cap on this entire world affairs project, and we're going to look at globalization and nationalism. We're going to recap some of the important issues that we talked about, look at some points of departure for further research, and try to add some final thoughts on the work that we've done so far. So just a quick recap. Last week we talked about international justice and the anti-international justice movement, the way that conflicting viewpoints led some people to join into that international criminal court, and it led some people to opt out and sort of reduce the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court. Way back in week 1, we talked about the United Nations and why they were a good way to study world affairs, how the United Nations encompasses both the international aspect of having a lot of different nations together and the national aspect of putting important issues of national concern in the international ballpark. Then also the transnational aspect of taking people and taking their concerns and moving them across borders and back, regardless of where they're from, giving voices to nations and people that previously didn't have it. In week 2, we talked about the General Assembly of the United Nations and the way that the United Nations attempted to work through the Cold War after its foundation, after World War II, how the United Nations was made up of those 6 principal organs: the General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, and the International Court of Justice, and how through those the United Nations attempted to make a world that would not have World War III and that would also help the decolonization process. We talked about peace and security and the response into conflict and the way in which the United Nations attempted to end conflict, sometimes unsuccessfully, without first starting a war. And Kofi Annan talked about that a lot in the book that you read, where he reflects on his journey as the Director General of the United Nations. And then we talked about the economic and social actions, how through economic and social reform, Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations attempted to get rid of global poverty. And we are in 2017, you've probably seen that that wasn't successful. Again, either an indictment against the United Nations if you're not pro-United Nations, or an argument that other nations, individual people, need to work harder to make the United Nations work. Then we talked, like I said before, justice and human rights, and how more attempts to bring this sort of egalitarian world together may have failed because nations aren't buying in. Then we ended with that Save the Children quote: "We have to devise means of making known the facts in such a way as to touch the imagination of the world. The world is not ungenerous, but the unimaginative and very busy." So hopefully your imagination has been sparked in some way, and despite your busyness, you're willing to engage people in the changes that you wish to see made. First, we're going to talk about globalization. We sort of started talking about it when we talked about economic globalization, and I gave you that David Held quote, who said, "Globalization may be thought of as a process or set of processes which embodies a transformation in the spatial organization of social relations and transactions, assessed in terms of their extensity, intensity, velocity, and impact, generating transcontinental or interregional flows and networks of activity, interaction, and the exercise of power." You can be the judge whether or not Pascal Kirchner, this political cartoonist, captured that definition in his image. It looks like someone's giving money to the soldiers from a bank, which goes into military spending, which goes into taking money from people, which makes people work, which goes into the shipping industry, which goes back to the banks. And there's a cycle of globalization. Pascal doesn't seem like he's a big fan of globalization, and there's definitely multiple viewpoints to this sort of imagery. Now, we use David Held's definition for most of this. Since week 3 we've had it, and it's a pretty good definition. This week we talk about Manfred Steger's definition, where he says basically the same thing. It's a multi-dimensional set of social processes that can't be confined to any single thematic framework. Like, globalization is so huge that we can't possibly put it down and just talk thematically about economic globalization. Because, like you see in Kirchner's picture, you can talk about economic globalization. That's just the banks part. But you're missing the social and the cultural and the military, the political. So Steger sees it as a bigger multidimensional process. To the left is a pin, I'm a world citizen. We talked a little bit about refugees. There's a movement, a growing movement in which people claim world citizenship, in which they're not loyal to only one nation because they are a member of the world. It hasn't really taken off, and there's not many people who are only world citizens, but they do exist out there, and it's worth taking a look. So we know globalization's a contested concept, but it's at the root, I argue, of almost anything in world affairs. You take anything in the paper, anything online, and at some point we could talk about globalization. So what is globalization? Let's look back a little bit. Historically, there's been a lot of globalization. These are routes of ancient commerce. You can see Europe, Asia, Africa. Because these 3 continents are so close, globalization has never struggled in these places. The ancient Silk Roads from the Near East all the way to China, trading spices and trading goods across thousands of miles, and they had to walk. So we're talking pre-modern period. Before, well, we haven't defined modernity in this course, so there's some arguments there as well. But I'm talking about what you might imagine as pre-modern. There's still a sort of globalization because someone might go from Ephesus in Asia Minor all the way to China. That's a long way. And it would take a long time, but it's still exchanging goods and ideas in this sort of global pattern of globalization. As early as 3000 BCE, that's like 5,000 years ago, there were wheels in Asia. Like I said, money is made circles so it can keep on moving. Wheels are circles so they can move. And when people start moving, trade networks are developed and globalization is created. So a lot of nativist type thinkers say that you can sort of have a square, a certain area, and it doesn't have to interact with any other area. But what we've seen in history and historic globalization is that people will get out of those squares. That's just what they do. So through this ever-seeking, changing, whatever it is, modernity, being modern, people are globalizing the world by changing what they do, changing the earth. Even if they stay in the same square, the act of breathing is contributing CO2 to the environment. That's modernity. That's changing. That's globalization. So that's one form of globalization. You have exploration. So if you try to get out of that little box that you've drawn around yourself, certainly globalization because you're expanding. And then expansion of territory. So when you conquer someone else, that's globalization. The Mongols were one of the most famous conquering groups. The Mongol hordes came from Central Asia and conquered all the way to the gates of Vienna. And they were famous for letting conquered groups keep their own religion. But that didn't stop the influence they made. So they may conquer, they might even adopt the religion of those they conquered. They still changed the way in which people operated. One of the things the Mongols did well was ride horses. So if you study military history, you know the horse is a pretty important military invention. So historic globalization is enormously important. We talked about economic globalization, another type of globalization, last week, so I'm going to skip it this week when I continue to talk about the types of globalization. Another one is political globalization. Now, these are, in green, the countries that the United States, in blue, has relations with. If you can't see the map right now, it's every country except Western Sahara, Northern Cyprus, Crimea, if that's even a country, Syria, Iran, North Korea. Every other country the United States has some form of political relations with. Now, relations are a form of globalization. If you talk to another country in some way, you are contributing to globalization. Now, political globalization is not limited to what one country talks to another, but the whole idea of nations. So, in 1648 in Europe, there's something called the Peace of Westphalia. This is really the birth of the nation state. Before this time, there's no idea of different nations. If you're from Europe or you've been to Europe, you know when you cross over the border from France into, say, Spain or Germany, you're not going to see a line on the ground when you cross over to the country. If you've been to Canada, some of the borders used to not even be patrolled. You could just be driving and then, oops, we're in Canada, just like you're going to another state. In fact, before the 1940s, you could do that with Mexico. Well, after this treaty Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the idea of nation is sort of begins to grow, and eventually through Western expansion, it's sort of spread across the world. And today we have a global map like this, where there's lines that clearly define what a nation is. Those lines don't actually exist, but we have a general idea. Some countries built walls on those lines. Now, that is political non-globalization, right? Because you're demarcating which state is which. No, but even after you've decided which state is which, you can't stop ideas, people, and things from flowing over those lines. So this is what political globalization is. As soon as those lines are drawn in 1648, and it's between nations in Europe that happens, ideas exchange over those lines constantly. We see it happen in World War I when nations invade each other, a form of globalization. That's that aggressive globalization where you conquer someone. When Woodrow Wilson tried to start the League of Nations with his 14 points and said anyone who has this idea of self-determination, who, we studied this in week 1, who has the idea that they're a nation can sort of get their independence and form their own nation, in a way, you might think that's taking away from globalization because each tiny little nation can carve out their new territory, yet the idea in itself that you can become a nation is deeply rooted in the Enlightenment, deeply rooted in Western and European history. So it's still a part of globalization. Then there's more obvious examples like the League of Nations, where nations work together, and the United Nations, which we've studied. In addition to this, there's things that go beyond political boundaries, that go into this social or cultural or even environmental globalization. Things like pollution. When Japan had a nuclear reactor meltdown in Fukushima, the nuclear waste was found washed up on a shore in Washington. It had traveled across the Pacific Ocean to Washington State. It wasn't a lot, it was trace amounts, but it still existed. If a nation pollutes more than other nations and contributes to the rising sea levels, island nations will feel that. Even though they might not have political relations, they might have environmental or social relations. There's also migration, money, weapons, all these things go across boundaries in globalization. Now, this is a heat map of tweets during the terrorist attack in France when people said, "Je suis Charlie." I am Charlie, because Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, the publication, was attacked by terrorists. So people, that became a popular hashtag, and Twitter maps where the tweets come from. And you can see this is a global phenomenon. Even though the attack was in Paris, in France, it went well beyond France into a global environment where everyone was hashtagging this phenomenon. There's very few parts in the world that were not lighting up. So I don't know what's going on with Mongolia or with Kazakhstan. They don't seem to have any heat. But you can see almost all of the world has, and especially the epicenter in France has the most. But you can see this is a social interaction that's taking place across national borders. It does not matter at that time if you were in Iceland, Tokyo, East Timor, Botswana, any of those countries, and especially Latin America, any of those countries were contributing to this social globalization. We're having one heartbeat for this terrorist attack. So it's sort of like this concept that maybe 200 years wouldn't have even existed. There were some people on our planet who didn't even know that there was a Paris, France. And now, today, people not only know, but claim to be socially in tune and physically there, or spiritually there, or mentally there, even though they're not physically there. That's social globalization. And we can talk about this in a lot of different ways. It's been called the McDonald'sization of the world. There's Starbucks nearly everywhere in the world. There's media conglomerates, media companies that have the rights to various nations to broadcast the same television shows. China is one of the biggest consumers in Hollywood films. You see the logo of Chevrolet emblazoned on Manchester United soccer shirts in its biggest fan bases in Southeast Asia. It's incredible. This is social globalization. So it's a phenomenon that we have to understand if you understand world affairs. So in order to understand world affairs, you have to first understand globalization and sort of this interaction that we're dealing with that goes across boundaries. Now, social globalization can also be ideological and can promote certain beliefs. And these beliefs, the ideology of globalization, are challenged a lot. Some people ask, is this inevitable? Now that we have technology, is this sort of globalization inevitable? Is it going to happen to everyone? Every once in a while, National Geographic will post some pictures of a new tribe that was found in Brazil that has not been contacted by humans except when National Geographic found them. And those are interesting stories, but eventually those people are found. So is it really inevitable that not only will everyone be found, but will that tribe eventually have Twitter and feel that same heartbeat as people all over the world? Another one says, is anyone in charge of it? Is Twitter in charge of this global social explosion? Or is Twitter just sort of facilitating something that they have no control over? What if the world, now this is this is non-factual. This is um, ahistorical. This is a what if. They're fun to do, but really ultimately empty, vacuous. What if something like the purge happens and Twitter, a popular Twitter handle becomes it's purge time? Or I didn't really watch the movie. It wasn't very appealing to me. But what if it's negatively impact? Is Twitter still responsible for that? Who's in charge of this thing? And that makes politicians and people very nervous that no one's in charge of globalization. Then another question people ask is, does it really benefit everyone? So if you say, okay, this benefits everyone, people knew about the terrorist attacks in Paris, then I would say, does it really benefit the people in Madagascar, the island off of Africa? Because they didn't seem too concerned. There was no hashtags coming out of Madagascar. And even if there were, how would that benefit them to know of terrorism? In many ways, it might do them worse, because when was the last time Madagascar was impacted by terrorism? Maybe pirates in the 16th century. But that's a real question. Does it benefit everyone? And the last one is, does it spread democracy? Advocates of democracy see globalization as sometimes working in an anti-democratic way, because people see the failings of their leaders and try to go anti-globalization. So I've previewed some of the questions that people ask, but there's also a lot of challengers and a lot of challenge movements. So this is a inequality index. This is how much inequality there is within countries. So that means how many rich people compared to how many poor people. And you can see inequality is enormous in the southern tip of Africa, in parts of Latin America, Russia. But what might shock you is the enormous amount of inequality in Mexico, the United States, and China. At least the United States and China, certainly Mexico has a big economic output and population. These are countries that have and Brazil as well, that have very important roles in the world, yet within their own borders they're struggling with inequality. Now, so people in the United States, people in China, people in Brazil, Mexico, and Russia really might start to question, is this globalization helping us? Because they see that the inequality in Europe is not much. Countries like Finland, like Sweden, like Norway do not have much inequality at all. They seem to be doing fine by this globalization system. Yet countries in the global south, if you go draw a line right in half, you see there's a lot of red below the border. So they might ask, what good is it to me that everyone cares about the terrorist attack in France, sorry to belabor a point, when I can't get a job myself in the United States? Or what does it matter to me if in Canada they have excellent schools if I'm in China and I've never been to a big city? And there's people in the United States and China who do live with this problem, and it's something that the challengers love to highlight. So again, I don't get political very often, but it's just such a good example. Donald Trump talking about how can the United States be worried about the global environment when there's people in Pittsburgh who don't have jobs. Pittsburgh used to be a thriving city that would take a lot of coal from the earth, and people had jobs in coal factories and in similar jobs that involved coal with the railroads, things like that. So people like Trump are challengers of this globalization idea. He's saying, I'm not too worried about the fact that Germany is doing very well selling its cars to the United States. This is another example he's used. When people in Detroit who used to work for Ford no longer make cars. So it's sure helping the consumers in the United States who can buy German cars, and it's helping the Germans because the Germans are making the German cars, but it's not helping the people of so-and-so United States. So these are the challengers, and there seems to be an ebb and flow. Every once in a while you get someone who's very pro-globalization, like Barack Obama. President Obama wanted to continue to expand the United States input into the world. He signed the Paris Agreement saying we have to change this environment because the whole world is being impacted by the environmental change. Just because our higher tax might hurt the coal miners in Pittsburgh, we need to do it now because otherwise California and Florida are going to be underwater in about 70 years. Now, that was just a hypothetical argument, but that's something that President Obama might have used to justify his example. So you can see where the real tension is. How can you decide to save some when you're not going to save the others? And the question is this global capitalist system, is it possible to save everyone? And that's the question that remains. So there's people on both sides. And again, choose your own side after doing the research. Look at the evidence. What evidence matters to you? And then you can make your argument. Look at the evidence, weigh the evidence. Some people say this, some people say this. And then from that, you draw your own conclusions. And that's doing world affairs. That's history. That's politics. So, what is the future of world affairs? Here's a blank map. You can be a globalist, someone who thinks that economic, political, cultural future of the world is in a global sort of citizenship where these lines start to fade away and nations start to fade away and groups can come together. Maybe it looks something like the EU, where you can drive freely across the borders, where you can work in different countries regardless of your place of birth. Or maybe you're a protectionist, someone who blames globalization for the economic, political, and cultural struggles of our nation, whatever your nation is. And saying that the globalization isn't concerned with the well-being of my people and maybe not even necessarily other people. Maybe you're not convinced and you're not totally against globalization, but you're looking for a middle path in which there's not so much inequality in the world, but no one has to suffer. It's up to you. And we started and we are ending again with this Kofi Annan idea of we the peoples, and it's up to you to make the change. It sounds contrite and you hear it over and over, and there's movements that sometimes are hollow after the words fade away and people just go back to their daily lives. But you really do have a chance to make a change. You have a whole life to make a change, and even though there's 7 billion and someday there's going to be 8 billion people on this earth, you have the evidence at your fingertips, and from the evidence you can make your argument, and you know people, and you talk to people, and you can engage with people, and by talking to people you can figure out what people think and what direction our world might go. And whether you think it or not, you influence people with every interaction you have, whether it's handing over money to a cashier and you smile at them and say have a good day, or if you just slap the money down on the counter. An action as simple as that has a global impact, because one interaction can change the entire day of someone, one person's interaction with another person, so on and so forth, until you have people constantly interacting with each other, impacting the way they impact the earth. So I know we got a bit extrapolated, a bit abstract at the end, but really, the future of world affairs is yours. Thank you for being a part of this course, and feel free to continue to follow hourofhistory.com and the Hour of the History YouTube podcast, because I'm going to continue to add videos. Thank you.